Caesar Augustus was the first emperor of Rome, but when it came to food, he was a man of simple tastes. Rather than indulging in the lavish feasts enjoyed by later Roman emperors, he preferred a simple diet of bread, fish, figs, and fresh cheese, like this 2,000-year-old recipe which is for a predecessor of mozzarella. So thank you to Sid Meier's Civilization 7 for sponsoring this video as we dine like the Emperor Augustus, this time on Tasting History. It is no secret that I love history. However, did you know I also enjoy video games? In fact, I have spent much of the last 2 decades of my life playing Sid Meier's Civilization. I started back in college with Civilization 3, and now I'm going to be playing Civilization 7 because it is available for purchase and download today. So being an enthusiast of this game, when they reached out to sponsor a video, I was really actually very excited. Mainly because it's the perfect fit for the channel. The game is all about building an empire through different ages of human history. And when it comes to building empires, nobody did it better than Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. He is one of the many leaders that you can play as in the game, and I thought he was kind of perfect to do a video on because while he was one of the greatest leaders that Rome ever produced, when it came to eating, he was kind of plebeian in his habits. The ancient biographer Suetonius wrote that he was a light eater, for I would not omit even this detail, and, as a rule, preferred the food of the common people, particularly the coarse sort of bread, small fishes, fresh, moist hand-pressed cheese, and green figs of the second crop. And he would not wait for dinner, for he ate wherever and whenever he felt hungry. A man after my own heart. Not so much the coarse bread part, but the eating whenever I'm hungry part. So with this description in mind, I thought that I would recreate one of the foods that Suetonius mentions, the cheese. Cheese should be made of pure milk, which is as fresh as possible. It should usually be curdled with rennet obtained from a lamb or a kid, and equally well with fresh sap from a fig tree. The least amount of rennet that a pail of milk requires weighs a silver denarius. It is sprinkled with pounded salt. Some crush green pine nuts and mix them with the milk and curdle it in this way. The method of making what we call hand-pressed cheese is the best known of all. When the milk is slightly congealed in the pail and still warm, it is broken up and hot water is poured over it, and then it is shaped by hand. So the process, especially the part about putting it into hot water and then forming it by hand, is very similar to how modern mozzarella is made today. Now, they're not the same. The word mozzarella didn't even come around until the 16th century, and most mozzarella, at least in Italy, is made from buffalo milk, which they did not have in Italy in the ancient Roman Empire, but it's definitely a predecessor of mozzarella. So for this recipe, what you'll need is a ½ gallon or 2 liters of whole milk. Now this milk can be from a sheep or a cow or a goat. I'm using cow milk because that was what was available. And it can be pasteurized, but it cannot be ultra pasteurized. That process does weird things that make it so it doesn't make cheese as well. It also can't be homogenized, same reason. So you might have to search, especially here in the States, for just pasteurized, non-homogenized milk. It's usually called like cream top milk or something like that. Then an 1/8 teaspoon of rennet diluted into 2 tablespoons of water. And you can use animal or vegetable rennet. He mentions both. Animal rennet usually comes from the stomach of an unweaned young animal like a cow or a kid, which is a goat or a lamb. But he also mentions different forms of what are essentially vegetable rennets made from fig sap, but he also mentions safflower oil and some other things. So either one works. Then you also need a tablespoon of sea salt and a ½ cup of pine nuts. So why pine nuts, you ask? I'm not entirely sure. I have a theory though. So when you're making most modern cheeses, you use some sort of acid to acidify the milk. When it comes to mozzarella, that's usually citric acid. They did not have that in ancient Rome. They did have vinegar and other things that you could use, but it turns out that pine nuts will do the same thing. I'm just not exactly sure how much it's going to need, so we're just gonna test it out. So it is going to be different again than mozzarella today because the citric acid is what gives it kind of that stretchiness. This doesn't have that. So first take the pine nuts and lightly crush them and put them into a large pot and then pour the milk over them. I let it sit for about 20 minutes to let the pine nuts do what I think is their thing, and then I removed any pine nut pieces floating on the top. At this point, you set the pot over medium heat and stirring, bring the temperature up to about 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 Celsius. Then take it off the heat and add the rennet. Now you want to make sure that the rennet gets fully incorporated, but you don't want to stir too much because as soon as you add it, curds will start to form and you don't want to break them up. So very gently stir it in, and then once it's incorporated, cover it and leave it. Now if you are using citric acid or vinegar, it only takes about 10 to 12 minutes for the curds to fully separate from the whey. I did not have that happen. It took about 25 minutes, and even then the curds were not as smooth as most modern versions, but they did separate enough that I was able to cut them into about 1-inch squares. Really, the curds were sort of between a farmer's cheese and a mozzarella. Once they're cut up, then again very gently stir them around in the whey and let them sit for another 5 minutes while the curds fall to the bottom. Then we need to separate the curds and whey. So gently drain the whey through a strainer until you have just the curds left. Then add in the salt and work that into the curds. Columella says this will help draw out more whey. Then let the curds sit for another few minutes while you heat a pot of water to about 170 degrees Fahrenheit or 75 degrees Celsius. And once it's hot, pour it onto the curds just enough to cover them. Gently stir the curds around in the hot water, and the water is going to be quite hot, so you can use gloves or a spoon if need be. And the curds should start to melt together. Now the amount of liquid you keep in the cheese is really up to you, but the more you squeeze, the firmer the cheese will be. And as you shape it, if it starts to get too firm and falls apart, just add more hot water and it'll come back together. Columella doesn't really specify when the cheese is done, but it just took a few minutes to get it into a mass that held its shape, so at that point, it's really ready to eat. But you've only got a few days to eat it. It does go bad fairly quickly, even in the refrigerator for maybe 5 days at most. And in ancient Rome, they didn't have refrigerators, so they would just hold it in water, and it really needed to be eaten the same day, maybe the next day, which is why Suetonius says that it was moist, fresh cheese that was eaten by the Emperor Augustus. Often all we get to learn about historical figures are the major touchstones in their life. Marriages, political turmoil, battles won and lost, that sort of thing. But we need to remember that every person through history was just as complicated as we are. They had their little quirks, their little likes and petty dislikes. And so I am grateful that those petty dislikes and likes of Emperor Augustus were written down by Suetonius. Now, Suetonius was incredibly biased and often put in kind of his own opinions on things and steered the narrative to his own ends. And, not the best historian. He didn't really always rely on facts like some later historians, but he makes for a very interesting read, and he does give us a more well-rounded picture of the character of some of the people that he talks about, like Augustus. Also, I am going to refer to him as Caesar Augustus throughout, even though originally his name was Octavian. Didn't get Augustus until he was about 35, but for simplicity's sake, I'm going to talk about him as Augustus the whole way through. Now, just as he had two different names, he also had two very different sides to his personality. Some say that he enjoyed opulence and had a lavish lifestyle, while others say that he was very simple in his tastes. Some say that he was generous and kind, and others say that he was cruel and draconian. I also love that the dichotomy of his character is reflected whenever he introduces himself in Civilization 7. When he meets another leader, he says, "I am Octavian, Augustus Caesar, a simple first citizen and emperor of the world." But he says it in Latin, and I love that the game designers even paid such close attention to detail so that his pronunciation of Latin is not that of ecclesiastical Latin, church Latin of later years, but of the classical Latin spoken in 1st century BC Rome, which would be with a hard C. So instead of Caesar, he pronounces it
Augustus Caesar.
And attention to detail is, precisely according to Suetonius himself, why he includes a whole section in his biography of Augustus on the emperor's dining habits and entertaining habits. he starts off by talking about a particular dinner, an opulent dinner that Augustus threw called the Dinner of the 12 Gods. And it was a private affair, but word got out, and the public, when they heard about this dinner, were aghast. It caused quite the stir. Essentially, all the guests showed up dressed as gods and goddesses. Augustus was dressed as Apollo. And so when people heard about this, they thought it was sacrilegious. Apollo's part was lewdly played by impious Caesar. He made merry at a table laid for gross debauchery. It was said that the gods themselves were even so upset that they turned their faces from the earth, and Jupiter himself, his thunder-mocked, fled from his golden throne. It didn't help that this banquet took place during a period when the people of Rome and its surrounding areas were going through a famine, so it led people the next day to shout cries in the streets of "The gods have gobbled all the grain, and Caesar is Apollo, true, but he's Apollo of the torments." Suetonius pairs this with another criticism of the emperor, saying that he had a particular fondness for bronze Corinthian statues. So much so that it led him to maybe do some unscrupulous things around the prescriptions. The prescriptions were lists of Roman citizens who were declared outlaws, and there was one particular prescription that was put out during the time of the Second Triumvirate, the one of Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, the future Augustus. Well, when your name was put onto this list, not only were you declared outlawed, but all of your possessions were forfeit. And some people's names were put on the list, supposedly by Augustus, Octavian, who in their possessions had a large amount of Corinthian bronze statues, which, once they were confiscated, found their way into the collection of Augustus, who liked collecting things. One of the most interesting things, I think, was that he liked collecting dinosaur bones. Though Suetonius says, "At Caprae he collected the monstrous skeletons of extinct sea and land monsters, called the bones of giants." But while Suetonius includes all these criticisms in his biography, he also says that Augustus easily disproved all of them. They were slanderous. And one way that he disproved his love of opulence and luxury was that when in Egypt, he went to the palace of the Ptolemies and didn't take any of the fine furniture. All he took was a single cup of agate. So that disproves that he liked fine things. Case closed. Though Suetonius does say that there were two criticisms of Augustus that even he could not refute. One was promiscuous lustfulness, even after marriage, and the other was he loved gambling. Suetonius says that not only did he gamble during Saturnalia, when it was allowed, but pretty much on every other day of the year as well. Mostly during meals, something which he himself freely admitted. Augustus wrote, "My dear Tiberius, we dined with the same company, and we gambled like old men throughout the meal, both yesterday and today. And over the course of 5 days of this mealtime gambling, I lost 20,000 sesterces, though that was because, as usual, I displayed excessive sportsmanship. But that is how I like it. My generosity will win me immortal glory, to be sure." And he's humble, too. Actually, he was supposedly quite generous, at least if it meant that he could keep gambling. Whenever he would throw a dinner party, he would give each guest 250 denarii just so they could gamble with that money while they ate, kind of like seed money. So that must have cost him quite a bit, because he did throw a lot of parties. Though his parties were only for the elite. He was, it sounds like, kind of snobbish, and paid particular attention to the level of a person in society when inviting different people to dinner and when seating them at the table. Valerius Messala writes that Augustus never invited a freedman to dinner with the exception of Menas, and then only when he was to be honored for having betrayed the fleet of Sextus Pompey and delivered it into Augustus's power. And these dinner parties, with their highfalutin guest lists, were quite nice, but Augustus, who wanted to make sure that people saw him as generous, yet not ostentatious, made sure that the dinner consisted of 3 courses or of 6 when he was at his most lavish. There was no needless extravagance, but a most cheerful atmosphere. He was known for his ability to draw guests who were silent or chatted under their breath into the general conversation. He also enlivened the meal with musicians and actors, or even strolling performers from the circus, though the most common were professional storytellers. Which is why in Civilization VII, Augustus is an excellent choice for both a military expansion as well as a cultural victory. It's those storytellers. Though Augustus himself probably missed out very often on the professional storytellers because he was said to usually arrive late and leave early. Always leave them wanting more. Or at least make them think that you're just too busy on matters of state to enjoy all 6 courses. And while 6 courses may sound like a lot to us, it was nothing for the feast of a Roman emperor. Vitellius, who I did a video on a few years back, was said to have dozens of courses at each meal, each one costing more than the last. But that's not to say that Augustus was cheap. Like I said, he enjoyed being generous, especially during festivals. He would often give gifts to his guests at the dinner parties during times like Saturnalia. And sometimes these gifts could be expensive clothes or even gold and silver coins, though sometimes they could be haircloth, sponges, pokers, and tongs, and other such things under misleading names of double meaning. One example of this would be like he would have 2 gifts and give them to 2 different people, saying that both had to do with a dinner party. And one person would open theirs and it would be a new toga or a dress meant to wear to a dinner party. The other person opens theirs and it's a piece of raw steak. Romans thought this kind of thing was hilarious. I got you a gift, but it sucks. Isn't that funny? Though, I guess it's not that far off from the modern day white elephant party. So, ancient Romans, they're just like us. But frankly, I think that the gambling and mean-spirited gift-giving were necessary to keep Augustus occupied at these meals, since he wouldn't actually eat at them. It was often said that besides the fact that he had simple tastes, he would eat in between meals. He would snack and graze even while traveling. He wrote several letters saying things like, "I ate a little bread and some dates in my carriage, and as I was on my way homeward from the Regia in my litter, I devoured an ounce of bread and a few berries from a cluster of hard-fleshed grapes." So essentially, he spoiled his appetite and would be totally full by the time his guests arrived. But he came to the dining hall nevertheless and watched them eat. Which is not creepy at all, just sitting there watching somebody else eat. Wait, that's literally what happens here on the channel. Anyway, he also was said to not have drunk too much wine. During the siege of Mutina, it was his habit to drink no more than 3 cups of wine at dinner. Which may sound like a lot of wine, but the ancient Romans would water down their wine, so it really probably wasn't that much. And even later on in life, when he developed a particular fondness for Rhaetian wine, he said that he would never drink more than a pint. And if he ever exceeded this, he would induce himself to vomit. Sensible. And throughout the day, should he find himself to be thirsty, probably because of all the vomiting, instead of drinking water or wine like a normal person, he would moisten his throat with a bit of bread dunked in cold water, or would eat a slice of cucumber, a sprig of young lettuce, or a sour apple, fresh or dried. Man was definitely complex. Now, it's hard to know really what Augustus was like as a person because, like I said, the writers of the time were less interested in facts and more interested in creating a narrative. And it doesn't help that Augustus himself was the king of propaganda. He was all about making people see him the way that he wanted to be seen, as we all do, but he was really, really good at it. While he was becoming sole ruler of an empire, he was also extolling the virtues of the Republic and the rule of the Senate. He won people over by hosting festivals, building roads, and building some of the greatest monuments Rome would ever know. While at the same time, he was passing laws like penalizing women who didn't remarry within 6 months of a divorce, not allowing senators to marry anyone whose parents were ever an actor, and forbidding soldiers from marrying at all. He ushered in the Pax Romana, a prolonged period of relative peace, while at the same time banishing basically anyone who didn't agree with him or anyone who he thought was unsavory, including the poet Ovid. He banished him from Rome and never let him back. Finally, Ovid's banishment was overturned by the city of Rome in 2017, 8 years ago. Though perhaps nothing shows this dual nature of Augustus more than the way that he treated his troops. He was said to be very generous with them. He also took care of them, giving them benefits after they left the military. On the other hand, he would punish them mercilessly, even using a punishment that was very little used in the centuries leading up to this period: decimation. When part of a cohort, which is a unit of 480 soldiers, would flee during battle, they would be divided into groups of 10. These men would draw lots, and the man who lost would be beaten to death by the other 9. Then those 9 would have their weekly ration of wheat be exchanged for barley. Seems like a bit of an uneven punishment going on there, but it does show how little regard the ancient Romans had for barley. It was usually just fed to animals and slaves. But I suppose it was this unyielding nature that made Augustus the great conqueror and leader that he was, which is why in Civilization 7 he is an excellent choice for a leader if you want to dominate the map. Something I am going to do as soon as I finish trying this ancient Roman cheese. And here we are, the fresh hand-molded cheese enjoyed by the Emperor Augustus. So it's nice and soft, and you can see it is still wet. I squeeze it and a little whey comes out, but it's still firm. It's holding together. It's not stretchy like modern mozzarella or many modern cheeses, but it does have. But it's not crumbly either. It kind of stretches and breaks. Also, it's yellowed, which is interesting, possibly because of the milk. It was kind of a yellowish milk that I used from whatever farm. I don't know what they're feeding their cows. Something yellow? Corn, maybe? I don't know. It's good cheese. It tastes a lot like mozzarella. Very mild. There is a nuttiness to it. Again, I don't know if that's the milk or the pine nuts, but it's more, there is something there to that flavor. It's also chewier. It's got a bit of a bounce to it, but it's quite good. I am curious, like, how it would melt. I don't think it would, but it'd be really good with just some coarse bread, sardines, and fresh figs, which is how Augustus enjoyed it. So thank you again to Civilization 7 for sponsoring this video. If you like history and you like video games, then go purchase Sid Meier's Civilization 7, now available on all platforms. I will be playing a lot in the future. This is one of those games where you can spend hundreds of hours playing and get really into it, but don't worry, I will continue to pry myself away from the computer and keep making videos so I can see you next time on Tasting History.